Here in Chapter 9, we're going to talk about emotion-motivated reasoning and critical thinking. We'll also be talking a little bit about the context of the assignment that's due at the end of the term about analyzing the War of the Worlds, because this is where we talk about the context of it a little bit, and we'll use some of the ideas that we've been talking about in this chapter and the next few chapters in order to answer the questions that will be part of the final project. So you'll want to pay particular attention to that and be listening to the World of Worlds and kind of having that in your mind while we are going through the next several chapters. You'll also be able to incorporate some information from the last chapters too. So, some of the learning outcomes we have for this chapter, we're going to explain the roles of motivation and emotion in thinking. Believe it or not, our thoughts are influenced by our emotions and our motivation. Probably not a shock to you at this point. We're going to critically analyze situations in which motivation and emotion lead to thinking errors, which probably won't surprise you either. We're going to do some application about the influences of motivation and emotion and how we can improve thinking. And then we are going to apply what we know to draw a well-reasoned conclusion from a discussion about whether emotions make us rational. And that's going to be kind of part of the context of the War of the World, so you'll kind of get fed a little bit of information about that final project in this chapter. So I'll start out with another what do you think to kind of get your mind going a little bit. So how do our motives and emotions affect our thinking? Okay. If we have a goal in mind, how does that impact the way that we think? How do our emotions impact our thinking? Okay. So an example, have you ever been so anxious while taking a test that it interfered with your ability to think about the questions? I think we've all kind of been there, especially if you think of something like a driving test. You get nervous being observed while you're doing a driving test and you don't perform or think like you thought you were going to because you're being observed. A lot of times we have motivation to succeed. Our strong negative emotions prevent us from thinking clearly. So now we're looking at an interaction between emotion and motivation, and one can be more powerful than the other in any given situation. A couple more things. How do lie detectors work, and do they accurately identify when people are lying? Right? So can they identify when people are lying? Yes. Are they accurate? Are they precise? Are they reliable? That's the question. Okay, we'll take a look at some information about lie detection in this lecture as well. And then last is good reasoning, cool or rational, and unaffected by the heat of passion or emotion. So can you be so good at reasoning that you're unimpacted by passion or emotion, or are there strong emotions that might make us irrational? So those are some things to think about as we're going through this chapter. You can stop and think about them a little bit more if you want to come up with some answers that you have. But let's go ahead and move forward and start with goals and motivation. So what is motivation? It's kind of this textbook definition is that it's a goal-oriented behavior that is arousing and is directing, meaning that it activates you to do something to move you toward the goal that you're trying to achieve. So, in short, it motivates you, not to use the cognate to define the term, but motivation is the motivating factor. It's the reason why you do something. That's goal-oriented. So some motives that we see, especially in cognitive psychology, are drives. So drives are motivations that are present, and they seem to be a force that is ever present and almost like the purpose for why you are motivated to do something. Then we have achievement motives. Then we have achievement motives. Those are the things that we do in order to accomplish a task or a goal. Lots of times those might be associated with work or with school or something. So you might be motivated to accomplish something at school because you want to complete the project or do a good job on it. Then we have social motives. Those are those things that we do that will elevate our status or get us something that makes us feel good in a social realm. Maybe it's to achieve friends, maybe status, whatever it is. It tends to be more socially related as opposed to just for the sake of achieving some kind of goal. Some can be both, by the way. Sometimes we brush our teeth because we want to have friends, and if you have bad breath and things like that, then maybe you're not going to have friends. So there's a social motive. Also, there's an achievement motive. It's something to do. It's a task to check off because it's part of a normal hygiene routine. So we can be motivated in different ways. These are not mutually exclusive motivation categories, and these are just examples anyway. So they're not really categorical so much as they are demonstrative of some of the ways that we can be motivated. All right, so how are all these things related? Well, we have motivation, emotion, and cognition. Okay, so motivation is the drive, emotion is the feeling behind it, and cognition is the thought process. So cognition is motivated, right? We think a certain way. It is driven. It is motivated by something that we want to do. Thinking is oftentimes is goal-oriented, so we don't often think unless we have a goal in mind for the thought. I'm trying to think of an example of that, and it's almost impossible to think of an example of it while you're trying to have the goal of thinking of an example. It's kind of an odd thing. But you're right, you can't really think of a time where you would think just for the sake of thinking and not for some kind of goal in mind. Even meditation, where it's kind of like this either sustained thought or a suspension of thought, has the goal of relaxation in most cases, or enlightenment, and if you're practicing for an Eastern religion purpose or something. So generally what happens then is that we evaluate situations if something obstructs our goal, such as failing a test, then we give a negative evaluation. So we call that appraisal. It's the idea that we negatively appraise something, or we think of something in terms of not being helpful. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the rest of this chapter. We also experience emotion like disappointment, anger, frustration, happiness, sadness. There are a lot of emotions out there. But we experience these emotions, and they will affect our thought processes. Everybody's had emotions that have affected thought processes. But also, the emotions can affect our motivation. Sometimes we're motivated to not feel an emotion, which is, kind of an extreme that you might think of. Like somebody doesn't want to feel sad so much that they will avoid, getting into relationships because sometimes they don't work out, and it'll make you sad if it doesn't work out. Some people avoid fear, like if you're afraid of heights, you will avoid something. So you might create, a way. Let's say you have to go on vacation, you don't want to fly, so you have to figure out a way to drive there. So you're motivated to drive and to find a straight, fast path because you don't want to fly. So we recognize that emotion does impact motivation and our thought processes along the way. So these three ideas, motivation, emotion, and cognition, are definitely intertwined and in some cases completely inseparable. So for the context of what we're going to be talking about over the next several minutes, you'll want to listen to this broadcast of The War of the Worlds. You're going to want to listen to it eventually for the final project so that you can have the entire context of what you're hearing. But you can follow this link. It is to a YouTube video of an uncut broadcast of the War of the Worlds radio broadcast that was presented in 1938. So you can have a look at that if you'd like to. And then you can come back to the presentation after you've listened to it. Or if you just want to kind of muddle through it and you know a little bit about the War of the Worlds radio broadcast, not the movie, but the radio broadcast, then you can just kind of go through. That's fine. So in short, there was a radio broadcast that Orson Welles had developed, and it was an hour-long realistic radio adaptation of the H.G. Wells book of the same name. So essentially it was a radio play, but Wells wanted it to be very realistic, so they did it and they cut into the broadcast as if it were a real warning for an impending alien invasion. And they only mentioned it, a couple of times throughout the radio broadcast that it was a radio play, but a lot of people didn't get the memo. Either they tuned in late, they didn't catch one of the few times where they acknowledged it, or whatever, and they thought it was real. So that was obviously very problematic for those people. And remember, this is 1938 when they didn't have CGI and things like that, and there was a real belief that things like this could happen because there wasn't a great understanding of outer space like we have now. Not that we have like a great understanding of outer space, we just have a small understanding of it. But we don't have the information that we have now. So that was very problematic. So what would happen is that there was panic among some groups of people who weren't aware of the fictitious nature of the radio broadcast. People were calling the police. They wanted to fight the Martians. They wanted to be on the front lines for it. Some people fled to different parts of the eastern seaboard because this all took place in New York. So the radio broadcast setting was in New York. So people were fleeing the area, trying to get away, and it was kind of just this mass chaos that happened. And you might be thinking to yourself, who would believe this? We believe a lot of things. And there are probably some good analogies to things that are going on right now that will sound like a lot like what they experienced then. Okay, so one of the things we think about is what led to the misperception. Okay, a lot of the times people think that it was just a matter of fear. Fear definitely does have an impact on it that motivates us to do things, but there's also a bit more information than just the emotion. Okay, so what we're going to see on the next slide are a couple examples of what looks like what the radio broadcasters described as the Martian machines that came to Earth. And it kind of looks like this. We have on the left in picture A, we have an example of the Martian machine as it would look, but being described by the authors and then reproduced for the novel and everything. So that's what it would look like. And then on the right was an example of what somebody thought was one of those things. Remember, it was dark outside and people were just looking around. And there are examples of other water towers that people could misconstrue as one of those, as one of the alien machines. So people would see these things and get scared because not only were they afraid, they thought that there was an authority figure telling them that something was wrong. That would be the radio broadcasters, and then they combine it with some kind of evidence for it, and now they're creating this composite of what was happening. And to them, the explanation for it was, oh my gosh, there's an alien attack. We have evidence for it, and this is a really bad thing. We're all going to panic. Okay? So what happened was that we had this interaction between motivation, cognition, and emotion. Okay, so the motivation was that people wanted to survive, right? It's the survival instinct kicks in. So when somebody hears and believes that there is an alien attack, their first thought process is, how do I survive this? So that's a strong motivating factor. And once you get kicked into fight or flight, the cognition starts to dwindle a bit. Okay, cognitively, they appraised the information. They evaluated the information that they had as dangerous. That was their appraisal of it. So cognitive appraisal becomes very important. It's what you decide about the information that comes in from a cognitive perspective. And once you declare it's dangerous, you've labeled it that way, and now you operate from that understanding, and that becomes your persevering thought process. Okay. Then we have emotion. The emotion. The emotion that they experienced was related to a goal inhibition. They thought that they were not going to be able to survive. So if the goal was to survive, they thought they weren't going to be able to do that. And then that created panic. People didn't know what to do. They got scared. They panicked. And then they started coming up with things that they were going to do to survive. Now, if you want to kind of see a dramatized version of what people would do to survive, then you can watch the Tom Cruise movie, War of the Worlds. I think it came out in like 2006 or 7 or something like that. Still a interesting movie based on the book, but there are some scenes in there that are rather harrowing about what people would do to survive. But, if you want to be entertained, you can do that. That is not part of this assignment. It's just a recommendation. Okay. So people had, in that example of War of the Worlds, they had some type of reasoning that they were engaging in. And sometimes we call this motivated reasoning. Okay, they had a motive to arrive at an accurate conclusion. Okay, but in light of knowing what the truth of the reality was, they came to a conclusion that was particular to them. Okay. So you can arrive at the accurate conclusion or a conclusion that makes sense to you. Sometimes people think that they're the same thing. Sometimes they are the same thing. But a lot of time when people come to a conclusion, it favors what they already believe, which is problematic because that means that they are just confirming what they already believe and not using a critical thinking lens. So in the case of the people who panicked during the War of the Worlds misperception, they used motivated reasoning where they were trying to arrive at a particular favored conclusion for them. Not favored in terms of the outcome, but the favored conclusion that made the most sense to them, which is what we go by. We go by what makes sense to us, not what the reality is most of the time. Unless you're using a critical thinking lens, or it just so happens that what you wish to happen and what actually happens is the same thing, you're probably going to be engaging in that motivated reasoning that's more negative. Okay. The goal of critical thinking is to use motivated reasoning that arrives at an accurate conclusion, which takes a little bit of time. You have to think about it. That's that type 2 thinking. That's that deliberate, thoughtful way of arriving at a conclusion, as opposed to type 1 thinking, which is that automatic heuristic-based thinking that oftentimes gets us into trouble because all we're trying to really do is confirm what we already believe. So if we're just trying to arrive at a particular favored conclusion, then we have, again, that belief perseverance that says that I'm going to believe what I want to believe no matter what the evidence says. And furthermore, even if we did want to find evidence, we would probably engage in the confirmation bias that steers us toward looking at the evidence that only supports what we already think. So motivated reasoning that's based on coming to a particular favored conclusion is pretty much universally not a good idea. We want to arrive at a conclusion that is based on critical thinking, that uses evidence, and that challenges beliefs when they're supposed to be challenged. So we've talked about these in other ways, so I won't belabor them too much. But remember that belief perseverance is when we believe something even though we've been faced with contrary evidence for it. That's belief perseverance. Our belief about something perseveres even though we don't have evidence that supports our former belief. Right? Then we have confirmation bias, which is searching for evidence that supports the way that we already think and not searching for evidence that disconfirms what we believe. So it's not enough that you search for evidence that supports the way that you believe. You also have to look out there and see if there's evidence that supports a different belief or that disconfirms your own belief. That's important to do because that suggests that you are looking at both sides of something and weighing evidence against itself. If you aren't weighing evidence, that you're not really critically thinking, you're just trying to find evidence that supports the way that you already think. So we've talked a little bit about flying saucers in other chapters too, but it's worth reviewing because there's kind of this context that we can sink our teeth into about believing in something that hasn't been scientifically validated and how people can go so far as to form those beliefs and believe them to be true and not just for the sake of being entertained, right? So we've talked about an example of somebody reported seeing a UFO and calling it a flying saucer. Well, the name flying saucer sticks, so now that whenever anybody sees a UFO, they say, "Oh, I saw a flying saucer," and lo and behold, all of a sudden, all the UFOs that people see are flying saucers. That's what they say that they see, because that idea of flying saucer has been ingrained in their brains, and that's even persistent now. And that even in light of contrary evidence, even media outlets will refer to things as flying saucers rather than just UFOs because that initial label had stuck so well. So there is a connection between UFO cults and belief perseverance, and what happens is that the Seekers was an organization of people that believed that the world would end by a flood, but that there would be some aliens that would come and take them away from the planet, saving them from the flood. And they predicted that these floods would happen, and the prophecy failed twice. So they had this prophecy that said the flood's going to happen on these dates. It didn't happen on either date. And it makes sense that if somebody recognizes that the prophecy didn't come to pass, then they would say, "Oh, maybe I'm wrong about my prophecy or about the nature of the prophecy." No, that's not what happens. People have a problem with being confronted with differing information about what they think. We call this cognitive dissonance. So what happens is that these cult members had a struggle. They had to reconcile the fact that they had this prophecy that they had a firmly held belief about, and the fact that it didn't come to pass. So they have to come to one of two conclusions. Either they were wrong about the prophecy, or the prophecy itself is wrong. But something had to give. The problem is that when there's a discrepancy between a belief and something that happens, they typically will change the context of the belief that they had, so that it wasn't wrong. It was just maybe needed to be tweaked, or something else had happened, or something else intervened. They don't want to change their belief, so they will create a distortion around it that makes their belief make sense. Okay. So what happened in the case of the cult seekers of the cult members who were the seekers, was that the God of the earth had decided to spare them because of the dutifulness of the group and how they proselytized and spread the message of the seekers. Well, that's all well and good, but what it does is it supports the idea of cognitive dissonance, that there wasn't anything wrong with their prophecy, that something else had changed. And furthermore, they feel like that their belief is allowed to persist because they got other people to believe the same thing that they did. And when people in groups want to feel good about their decisions, they will convince other people of their decisions or their beliefs. And if other people will believe them, then they kind of internalize this idea that, oh, if other people believe what I believe, then it must be true. That kind of sounds familiar when we talk about politics, right? If somebody else believes what I do, then it must be the right thing to believe. So we call one of the reactions to cognitive dissonance an escape clause, meaning that after the fact, so after the God of the earth spared the planet, the people who believed it said that, oh, something else happened after the fact. So there's always this little asterisk about their prophecy that says, this is going to happen, asterisk. If it doesn't happen, it's because of this. So there really is no prediction there, but what it does is it gives them the ability to fight through their own cognitive dissonance, to fight through the pain of being wrong. They can still maintain their belief because there's always this little thing that they can rely on to explain what happened. Another related bias that we have about motivated reasoning is to evaluate oneself favorably. And there are several different ways that we can evaluate ourselves favorably. One of them is called the self-serving bias. It's also called the positivity bias, in that we tend to evaluate ourselves favorably. We want other people to see us favorably. So we will evaluate our decisions favorably. We will appraise the outcome of our decisions favorably, because that's what we tend to want to do. People generally don't want to be seen as unfavorable people. So we have this bias that makes us all seem like we're doing the right thing and the decisions that we come to are good. Related to that is something called the fundamental attribution error. And this is interesting because a fundamental attribution error looks different if you are applying it to yourself versus if you're applying it to other people. So typically what happens is that people will attribute their success to their disposition, or what we call positive traits and skills, but that when they fail, it's situational. And here's what that means, is that if something good happens in my life, I can say that it's because of the effort that I went through to make it happen. So it's my disposition. I have something about me where I made something good happen. But if something bad happens to me, it's because something situationally happened, like somebody did something to me, or there was an event that happened that inhibited my success. Whatever it was something else. The book uses the example of how students tend to look at grades, where if somebody gets an A on a test, it's because they studied and they worked hard and they're smart. But if somebody gets a D on a test, it's because the instructor gave them a D, or the test was too hard, or something else that was outside of them. It was external to them. However, when you attribute when you apply the fundamental attribution error to other people, it's backwards. So if I look at somebody else and I see that they're successful, I will say things like, oh, wow, they got lucky, right? Like as if something else happened that led to their success. But if something bad happens to them, I'll say something like, oh, well, they should have known better. or they should have done better, or they should have known it was going to happen. Okay, so the fundamental attribution error works in flip-flop when it's on other people, to where when other people have something good happen to them, we blame it on their situation. When somebody has something bad happen to them, it's their disposition. Sometimes we'll call this the wrong place, wrong time fallacy. So if something bad happens to somebody, they go into a bad neighborhood, you can say something like, "Oh, well, they shouldn't have gone to that neighborhood dressed that way." It's like, wait a second, something bad happened to them is because people hurt somebody else, not because they were dressed a certain way. So the fundamental attribution error in that case is that we blame the victim for something bad happening to them in a situation where it's not reasonable to think that something bad should have happened to them, because people are not responsible for the behavior of others. If other people choose to harm somebody else, it's not the fault of that person. It's that somebody chose to behave that way. So it's interesting how the fundamental attribution error flip-flops depending on the perspective. So before we go into the next one, there's a little exercise here. So the question is, how open-minded are you? Where 1 is not at all and 5 is very. And then if you asked how open-minded is the average student in your class, how would you rate them? And what's interesting about this is that more often than not, people will list themselves as something 3 or greater in terms of how open-minded are you. Okay, but for people who say how open-minded is the average student in your class, very seldom will they actually pick 3, which is curious because that's exactly what this question is asking you to do. If we're talking about average, that means that where is the middle person in your class, and probably the answer is moderately. When you look at the total scale that you have available. Now, people can be generally more open-minded or not, but if we're asking what's the average person, then it's probably going to be moderate. Okay? Now, what's interesting about this is that we tend to evaluate ourselves better than average. Okay, it is a self-serving bias because on average we want to seem better or more appealing than other people. But the funny thing about this is that you can't always be better than average, or you can't always appraise a group as better than average, because the rule of average is that somebody has to be below average. That's how arithmetic works. So everybody can't be above average. There's kind of a funny saying from a Prairie Home Companion, which is a radio show on NPR. I don't know if it's still on or not. The problem is that people have died, so I don't think the show has persisted. But you can probably hear old versions of it. But there's a segment called Stories from Lake Wobegon, which is a made-up lake in Minnesota, and at the end of every episode, the narrator says that, and that's all from Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are handsome, and all the children are above average. Well, obviously, all the children can't be above average. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek play on this better than average effect, because if everybody were above average, well, geez, wouldn't that mean that the average is just raised and that some children are still above and below average? The answer is yes. It's just kind of a cute play on that notion. But we tend to think of ourselves as above average in general, and we tend to think of groups that we belong to also as above average in general, which kind of deflates the idea of the average in the first place. I've mentioned a couple times that politics tends to bleed into these biases and these motivated reasoning conversations, and this is not about what party you align yourself with. This is about how people react when they have staunchly held beliefs, and there are kind of 2 realms of the world where people have staunchly held beliefs: politics and religion. And because politics tends to be a little bit more polarized, we'll stick with that for the sake of the example. Democrats and Republicans rigidly maintain differences and do not fairly examine the ideas of the other party. That sounds about right. Okay, partisans are sure they're right and their opponents are wrong. So in partisan politics, where you have basically different groups of people or parties of people, one group, we want to create this difference between the groups. And if we were going to get into it, we talk about social learning theory, where social learning theory states that the goal of a group is to create as much similarity within the group, but as much difference between the groups. So if I'm in a group and you're in a group, I want to say that my group is all the same, and your group is all the same, which means that our groups are very different from one another. That's kind of the deal. The reality is that most groups have more similarities than not, but that's not how group identity works. Anyways, we'll talk about that some other time. So what happens is that when I'm trying to defend my position, let's say as a Republican, let's say, and I'm going to find as much information I can about the Democrats or about my position that separates my thought from their thought, and I'm not going to seek out any information that looks at the similarities between our groups. So I'm not going to look at any information that disconfirms the way that I feel or the way that I think. And that becomes problematic because what that does is it just informs the confirmation bias, meaning that we're not really looking at the reality of the situation. We're just trying to use motivated reasoning in order to create separation between groups of people who otherwise are probably quite similar, except for certain important and major ideas, but not as many ideas as you would think. So moving more into the cognitive realm, let's start with talking about characteristics of an emotion and then kind of tying the emotions into cognitive appraisal and how we have different emotions and how those emotional states contribute to thought. So characteristics of an emotion, probably not going to be a lot of surprise here for you, but they can be expressive behaviors. So the behaviors that are attached to an emotion or that indicate an emotion can be considered to be emotional. So smiling for happiness or frowning for sadness, having kind of this scrunched up, furrowed face when you're crying or sad, eyes wide open in fear, those are all fine. Those are a good example of emotion. We have changes in physiological arousal, which are these physical things that happen to your body that you really aren't in control of. Like if you're angry and you clench your fist, those are physical changes that are being expressed behaviorally. That are indicating emotion. But physiological changes are these things that your body does pretty much automatically. So if you're angry, maybe your heart starts pumping more, maybe your blood pressure goes up a bit. You may start sweating, you might have muscle tension. So those kind of things happen when you're angry, and those are all physiological changes that happen. It's important to note the physiological changes because those are the things that people generally don't control. Although we can condition ourselves to react to certain stimuli or certain emotions based on practice and things like that. Like the first time that you went on a scary ride, it scared you, but then that fear became some kind of exhilarating feeling, so it became less fearful and more exciting. So those physiological changes can be manipulated or trained, but they're generally going to happen automatically. We also have subjective experience, so that there's a feeling of tension in your body, which can be objective too. You can have muscle tension when you're angry or any other emotion. It could lead to different kind of muscle tension, I suppose. But what we're talking about is just kind of like feeling wound up, let's say, if you're excited about something. It may not be a real physical wound upness. It would be kind of a weird thing to feel, but just kind of the sense that you're on key or on edge or something like that. And then what happens is that we have this action tendency. When we are in an aroused emotional state, we are more likely to behave because that shortcuts the thinking that would usually inhibit our doing. So the example they give here is that sometimes you have a desire to strike out a person who's angered you. That's going to be more likely to happen if you're angry, obviously, than if you're not angry. And I can't say obviously, but in the moment we don't really think of it that way because cognition is short when we're angry. So kind of these emotional characteristics, these kind of basic ways that emotions look are important to us because we're going to consider something like a lie detector a little bit later. But cognitive appraisal theory includes evaluating emotional states. So cognitive appraisal theory is when you use your situation to determine which emotion the person experiences. All right, so it's kind of an odd thing to say, well, wait a second, don't people just have emotions? Well, yes, they do, but what happens is that our interpretation or appraisal of a situation is what leads us to having the emotion. Consider somebody who gets really sad at a movie. Those people they're appraising their situation almost in reality to what they experience. So they're not separating themselves from the situation. Or if they're afraid of a scary movie or something like that. Right, they're not separating themselves from the movies, so their cognitive appraisal is that they themselves are in the same fear that the people on the TV are experiencing, and then that leads to some kind of experience that they have emotionally because they don't separate out the cognitive aspects about recognizing that the reality is that they're safe and everything from the emotional feelings that they're having. So their appraisal situation suggests that they're going to feel a certain way. Okay. So emotional, mood, and evaluative states differ in degree. So emotional states, or the way that we evaluate or appraise emotional states, are usually they're pretty susceptible to whatever you're feeling, because feelings, we tend to treat them as inalienable, meaning that the way that they are is the way that they are, and we try to make the world make sense around the feeling. So in that way, we have more weight to the appraisal of emotional states. Mood states are generally the way that we are predisposed to feeling in any moment. So if you're in a good mood or a bad mood, that might predispose you to how you respond in a particular moment. And your mood structures a lot of what you think about a situation. So consider mood to be a good indicator of how one might respond, although emotion can trump that if somebody gets scared in any moment. I'm thinking now on some YouTube clips I've seen of people who are walking down the street, they get scared by somebody dressed up as like a plant or something like that. Then the people who get scared will punch the person that's dressed up like a plant. Well, their mood up to that point did not suggest that they were just going to run around punching people, but their emotional state changed as a result of what had happened. So their cognitive appraisal in that moment was that there is a threat, and they reached out and punched somebody. Yes, it's more or less automatic, but generally that emotional state will overcome some kind of cognitive state. And the cognitive state, yes, you have to trigger yourself to punch somebody, but it happens very quickly. So it's very interesting how those kind of go together, and one can shortcut the other. The example from the text is understanding that there is a difference in the way that we perceive and deal with anger, frustration, and disappointment, which all tend to have the same kind of component parts to them in terms of goal inhibition, and it comes with frustration, disappointment, anger, this emotional state that's based on the lack of goal attainment that's occurring during frustration. So cognitive appraisal theory states that we are going to approach these three different types of they're all feelings. Yeah, they're all feelings, but frustration tends to be a little bit more mechanical in terms of you're getting stopped from something. But those feelings are going to be something that you evaluate differently based on what mood you're in or what emotions are aroused because of them. Again, cognitive appraisal theory is important for us mostly to understand that the way that we appraise a situation is not just based on our thought alone. It's based on several other factors like emotion and mood. There's also a theory called differential emotions theory, and what's curious about this is that it matches something called the Plutchik diagram. If you want to look up Plutchik diagram, which is a diagram of feelings and how feelings kind of combine to make other feelings, it's kind of an interesting thing. It's Plutchik, and it's pretty interesting. There are lots of different versions of it, but if you see one, you kind of get the feel for what it comprises. All right, so generally, emotions, they'll fall into distinct categories, and the sub-emotions or the component emotions can also fall within certain categories and combine to make up other emotions that can be categorically similar. Differential emotions theory kind of subdivides feelings into generally happiness, interest, anger, sadness, disgust, and fear. And again, there are different ways to categorize emotions, but it's important that we have some kind of understanding of the models that are out there. Again, these are all theories, so it's not like any one of them explains everything, but they go a long ways to kind of giving ideas about how emotions are qualified and they're put into different categories. the interesting thing about differential emotions theory is that Izzard suggests that each of these is biologically or evolutionarily based, meaning that they serve purposes. And I think that a lot of other theorists would agree with that. That's not an uncommon thing. I might even go so far as to say that all emotion is adaptive somehow, which means that it's biological or evolutionary. We tend to be beings that want to support our own functioning and our own survival, and we do a lot of things to do that, even psychologically. You can see on this slide that if you looked at these pictures, you'd be able to assign some kind of general feeling to each one. And although the feelings might overlap somehow, like something like disgust might be a combination of anger and disappointment, maybe, that you could distinctly put some emotions on here. What's interesting about this too is that it's relatively universal, meaning that people across all cultures are able to assign some kind of feeling that is meaningful and reasonably accurate to how the person is feeling. There's a lot of theories about how we interpret faces and the meaning of faces differently than other visual stimuli. So, and it tends to be universal. It's a somatic trait, meaning that it belongs to humans in general as opposed to cultural-based differences. Now that we talk about the physiological and biological indicators that we have some kind of feeling, one of the questions that we have that we need to think critically about is lie detectors accurate? So when you see this is not an uncommon setup for if somebody's going to do a lie detector. It's also called a polygraph. Poly means many and graph means picture, so it's many pictures or many graphs that show you different types of functioning. So in this example, you see from top to bottom, you have a chest EKG kind of measuring chest activity. In the heart, you have stomach activity measuring changes in that. The stomach is an interesting organ. It's able to do a lot of things on its own. Your stomach can digest food without the input from other parts of the body, so it doesn't need to be told to do its job, whereas a lot of other things like lungs need to be told what to do in the brainstem and things like that. It's pretty interesting. But it can indicate changes in functioning, in psychological functioning, curiously. You also have sweat duct activity, which is a function of being anxious typically. So if you've ever been anxious, maybe speaking in front of people or whatever, you've experienced this sweat duct activity where you get sweaty, your hands get clammy or whatever. So we can measure that, and that might indicate that somebody is lying. You also have blood pressure and heart rate, and that can fluctuate based on what you're being asked. So if you're asked a hard question or a question about something that you did that was wrong, and you feel like it was wrong, your blood pressure and your heart rate might go up. And then across the bottom, you have these different questions that were asked. And again, this is kind of fictitious. It's not inaccurate compared to what you might see, but this is made up data. And you can see how there are certain changes that happen when certain questions are being asked. And if you were to look at this and you'd say, oh wow, yeah, there is certainly some changes here that we're seeing as a result of being asked about lying. This looks like that somebody is lying when maybe they're asked, where do you work? And if they give an answer that they don't believe or that they feel nervous about, then they're going to have a change in their basal functioning. So that's more or less what you look at when you're looking at polygraphs. The problem is that polygraphs really don't accurately identify liars. The problem with them is that they measure changes in status, meaning that if you are asked a question and it surprises you, your body will respond a certain way. But the problem is that it's difficult to differentiate the way that your body feels compared to based on being asked a question that surprises you and a question that you're intentionally lying about. There's a lot of somatic change that happens in your body for various reasons, and it's not always because of lying. Really what happens is the polygraph measures your ability to maintain a constant state despite what you're being asked. So really to be able to respond similarly to all types of questions. Yeah, there are some biological and physiological things that people do when they lie, but it's not consistent enough and across enough people to consider the polygraph a reasonable way to identify liars. So the polygraph is not something that we tend to use as a way to identify liars. So you might threaten somebody with a polygraph, and they might say, "Okay, okay, I'll tell the truth," and maybe use it as an instrument that way to get people to tell the truth, so they don't have to get hooked up to a lie detector. But in general, it's not a way to suss out liars. So let's take a look at the internet and psychological problems and thinking areas that occur because and within it. All right, so emotion isn't just this mystic thing that floats around your body and your brain. We're able to map where emotion exists. The thing about it, though, is that the emotion doesn't exist just one part of the brain. It's part of a system called the limbic system, and the limbic system has different regions of it that spread out through different parts of the brain. A lot of it has to do with the amygdala, the ability to manage fear. And different fear responses. There are parts of the brain that are responsible for cognitive processing and executive functioning, and we call those the frontal areas. Sometimes we'll call it the prefrontal cortex if it's executive functioning specifically. But what's important to understand is that the limbic system is able to reach different parts of the brain, so that when you have a thought like, "I need to do something today," this executive process that has to be done, you also have an emotion that's attached to it. So both of these areas, the limbic system and the prefrontal and frontal areas, will process emotion. You may have heard of this, especially if you've taken an intro to psych class or an AP psych class. But there was a case of Phineas Gage, and in the mid 1800s, he was working as a railroad foreman. So they were out building railroads, and what happened was he was using a tamping rod, which is a way to tamp down the gunpowder or the blasting powder that they would put into rocks that would be able to blow the rocks up to get them out of the way so they could continue to put down the railroad. Well, he was tamping it down, and it created a spark when he was doing it. And this tamping rod's a big, long metal pole, and it exploded in the rock, and it came out. The tamping rod came out of the hole in the rock, and it went through his brain. Not a fun thing to happen. You can only imagine the wonderful medical skills they had in the 1850s. Okay. So after his brain injury, which he survived miraculously, he changed dramatically. Before, he was just kind of like an even-tempered dude. People really liked him. He made good decisions. He was the foreman. He was kind of in charge. But afterwards, he was profane. He wasn't able to maintain good judgment. His decision-making was hampered. He would have these outbursts. He was just a very imbalanced, dysregulated person afterwards. And one of the things that you will learn about psychology is that most of what we know about psychology is based on the cases that are wrong, incorrect, problematic, or abnormal. And Phineas Gage is one of those things where we learned about what happens in the brain when there are certain lesions. So you can kind of see this in this picture, different views of where the tamping rod went up through Phineas Gage's brain. And it was about inch and a quarter around, which is a big hole to put in somebody's brain. It went right through the prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, so more toward the middle. Medial means middle, so toward the middle. What was interesting about this is that with all of the injury that he incurred, that there wasn't any damage to the language that he would, or the language abilities that he had. And that's because language abilities are housed kind of in this parietal occipital region in the brain. So that was spared. So he was able to maintain verbal functioning. Now, what he chose to say was impaired because what you choose to say is governed by the prefrontal cortex. So that was okay. So I'm just trying to debate on where to do this or not. So we'll do it. The stop and think question for Phineas Gage is, what does it say about the relation between emotion and decision making in regard to the brain? Well, we find out that if he's before making good decisions, has good judgment, is an even-tempered person, then after this happened is not. We can say that there is one part of the brain where, at least one part of the brain, where decision making and emotion intersect. And because the limbic system sprawls throughout the brain, that makes a lot of sense, because if you have an injury to some part of your brain that's related to decision making, then you're probably going to have some kind of emotion that's tied to it too. So if that's the case, then it's what this says is that there is a space in the brain that those two intersect, and if you have damage to one, you're probably going to have damage to the other. So when we look at a picture of the brain, this is part of where the limbic system resides. So the limbic system is part of the hippocampal gyrus, but the limbic system is a large part of the brain. Okay, so there are regions of the limbic system that are distal or far enough away from the midbrain that reach out into these cortices that allow interaction. Okay? And we have the amygdala especially that has roots in the limbic system that talks about fear and responses and things. So very, very interesting how this all kind of sprawls out. So the limbic system, if you'd like a definition, set of midbrain structures that are involved in emotion and memory. And then the amygdala is part of the limbic system that is responsible for fear processing and anxiety. It's what causes a lot of chemical imbalance in the brain that due to long-term stress. So when you get stressed out, the amygdala has to work overtime in order to help regulate that. And if it can't over a long period of time, then you can develop things like depression. The amygdala is kind of like a regulator for the cortex, so for frontal and prefrontal lobe processing, that is about decision making and judgment. The amygdala will help to regulate those decisions and judgments that you're making in the face of some kind of need to make a decision, some kind of fear or stress response. Which is why people who have stress over long periods of time don't make great decisions, because the amygdala can't help fine tune the decision making and regulate the emotion behind it. All right, so that's what happened in the case of Phineas Gage. So we can have psychological problems and thinking errors based on trauma, but what was most interesting about Phineas Gage is that it led us to understand a lot of the abnormal ways that our brain functions, which gives us an indication of how our brain functions normally. Okay. So we'll take a look at a little bit of the critical reading that's in here. Sometimes we skip these because they're kind of more than what we want to talk about. But I think this one's interesting. That can give us a lot of insight into the critical thinking issues that go into emotions. So we're going to look at, do emotions make thinking irrational? Okay. So irrational is kind of a laden term. It's about whether or not the reasoning makes sense. And that can be tricky because everybody believes that their reasoning makes sense. And we have to rely on other people to tell us. But if we are not predisposed to critical thinking, then we're not going to believe them anyways. So it's tricky. So we need to look at the role that our emotions have. And there are lots of other things that we could look at too, like, does pride lead us to not think rationally? Like, do we maintain faulty beliefs through belief perseverance because of our pride or whatever other emotion that makes us feel that way? Something that's going to help us frame our thinking about do emotions make thinking irrational is identifying the central question, including some of the claims, the definitions, the approach that we might use to answering a question like this. This kind of sounds like a qualitative type question where we're going to be looking at some philosophical claims and things. So we might do that. We're going to look at the quality and quantity of evidence on each side under each heading. So when we look through each of these, we need to look at the quality and quantity of the evidence for each claim. So what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, how good is the evidence, how much of the evidence is there, excuse me. Okay. And then we want to draw a well-reasoned conclusion. So, do emotions make thinking irrational? I think probably a better question is, how irrational do emotions make thinking? But we'll go with what they gave us. Okay. So, rational. So, rational means that we rely on this good reasoning. Everything's logical. We're eliminating bias. We're free from thinking errors. That would be a perfectly rational way to go through life and to think. Can we always do that? The answer is no. But would we like to? Probably. And then irrational, again, is what I mentioned earlier. We have bad conclusions that we draw. We're not thinking clearly. Maybe we're basing our thoughts on some kind of bias or thinking error, or we have an emotion that is completely taken over, and we're trying to justify our emotions, so we change the way that we think about something to justify emotions, not the other way around. Okay. So we have some evidence about depression making people irrational. So Albert Ellis, who came up with a couple of things, among them was rational emotive behavior therapy, who came up with this idea that we have these things that make us behave a certain way. We call them antecedents, right? So if somebody cuts you off in traffic, that's the antecedent to your behavior, which is to maybe to honk your horn or flip them off or whatever you might do. Okay. And then there is a consequence to that. Maybe they flip you off back, and now you're really angry because how dare they flip you off after you flip them off, and all of a sudden you have this back and forth type of thing going on with them, and now you're more upset because how dare they? Okay, so now you're slated. All right. So you kind of have that ongoing thing that happens. That can happen with depression, where this irrational thinking takes over with people who are depressed, where they feel depressed and then they feel like life isn't worth living, and then all of a sudden, they have more thoughts about, okay, I'm depressed, and then they feel more depressed. And it's this downward spiral. And then all of a sudden, nothing makes sense. I start using these absolutes like nothing makes sense. I can't do anything. Everything I try to do is awful. Nobody likes me. So all these absolutes come into play. Well, if we look at the quality of the evidence about that claim, it was made by a clinical psychologist, somebody who is widely renowned in the field, but it's old research, and can it be better? Can it be updated? So that kind of is one of the arguments that we have when we think critically about this thought process on emotions and how they make thinking irrational. Okay, so we have some more recent evidence, recenter, I guess, 1993, where there was a bit more research done, more in a quantitative way, where they're able to do something that was more experimental. And what the researchers Palfy and Solovey found was that people were able to do deduction better than induction when they were depressed. So this bit of research follows more of a true experimental design, and it shows that depression can cause some mixed effects. So it's not just a matter of whether or not it inhibits thinking, it's about whether or not it inhibits certain types of thinking. And in this case, we're able to figure that out. So more research that contributes to the argument about do emotions make thinking irrational. Another example of research found that positive mood could improve efficiency and thoroughness of thinking. All right, so that shows that positive mood increases thinking, and that people who were in a positive used more cues and decision support system than participants not in a positive mood. All right, so what that means is that for people who are in a positive mood, they reached out more for resources to be able to make decisions. Right? So that kind of suggests that it's not about whether or not people who are depressed, for example, could, or who have strong emotions, whether or not they could think rationally. Now it has more to do with being able to access the cues and the support around you in order to create a rational thought. All right, so let's take a look and see what other evidence we have for this argument that do emotions make thinking irrational. Okay, so positive affect, you can call it happiness, like in the last one, found that people who were in a positive mood were more inclusive in categorizing things. The problem with that is that it didn't have logical consistency. So if you're in a positive mood, you're more likely to not categorize things specifically. So people, instead of using decision making in order to categorize something, they will just categorize everything together, and that is not logical thinking. That's not rational. If we're trying to categorize things, you can't just lump everything together if you're trying to create distinctions. So in that in that study, they found that people who have positive affect even struggle with maintaining rational thought. So now we have some evidence that says that when emotion is really, really high and they're overwhelmed by it, then they can't make decisions. But there is an adequate amount of emotional dysregulation that is okay for increasing thoughtfulness. So things like performance and stress, there is an optimal level of stress that you need in order to perform well or to make decisions well. So it's important that if we have too little emotion, then we tend to not make decisions rationally. Like in the last example, where if people are just generally happy, they don't feel a need to make decisions. They just kind of lump everything together in categories in that study. If you have too much, then you get overwhelmed and you kind of shut down because it's too stress-inducing to make a decision. But if you have just enough, then you can have effective judgments, just like they found in the Baumeister, DeWaal, and Zhang study. Blanchett found that sometimes emotions can hinder reasoning, and sometimes it can work in adaptive ways. What they found was that it really depended on the emotion and the task involved. It's not global that good emotions and large amounts are bad because you don't think critically, or that bad emotions in large amounts are bad because you're overwhelmed by it. It's more about the type of emotion that you experience, not just whether or not they're positive or negative, but the type of emotion that they experience that leads them to having differing levels of critical thinking. So that was the effect of one study. So we've looked at 6 or 8 studies now. What is the best conclusions for this example? Well, we found that some of the true experiments shown that emotion do hinder reasoning and judgment, that some experiments show that positive emotions may sometimes improve or hinder thinking, which doesn't really help us because we need to know something definitively, right? But really what this boils down to is, based on what we've looked at from these several studies, is that the trend is that the situation, the task, and the emotion all need to be considered when we are estimating whether or not somebody will have irrational thought. So really what it comes down to is that it's based on the situation. All right. So even though research has kind of shown in each study what the results might be, when you look at it all together, the best conclusion is that, based on the studies we've seen, that irrational thinking is affected by situation, task, and emotion differentially. What does that mean for us? That means that if we're going to help people or engage in rational thought, then we need to just continuously be aware of what we're experiencing, what our mood is, whether or not we're feeling a certain way, what our emotional state is. We need to be aware of those things. All right, so when we aren't aware of what we're feeling, thinking, what our mood is, then we have to deal with these thinking errors somehow. Right? So what happens in a lot of cases is that when people are trying to think rationally or convince you of something, they will appeal to emotion. And what that means is that they're going to say, wouldn't it make you happy if? Or wouldn't it make you sad if? Right? These are things that people will do in order to influence or persuade. What really needs to happen is that we need to separate the appeal from the content of the claim. One of the examples that I see frequently, and all too often, unfortunately, is the case of somebody who is panhandling, who's standing in a corner asking for money. They have a sign that says that they're homeless, anything helps, things like that. And it's tough because you're like, oh, well, I feel bad for this person, but at the same time, maybe you don't have cash or whatever, or you worry about what they're going to do with the money, and, that's your personal philosophy on what you want to do about that. But in a lot of cases, you can counter the appeal of the content from the claim, of the claim. So what happens is you think to yourself, well, what is the reality of what they're experiencing based on what what little you know about it? Can I separate myself from their plea, et cetera, et cetera? And it gets really hard, but that's what you have to do, is separate those two things out to make a rational thought on what you want to do. And if you choose to say, yeah, I feel sorry for the person and give them some money, that's perfectly fine. But what you need to do is think critically about it. Um, it gets really hard when they have animals, right? Dragging around a poor puppy dog, and you feel bad because you want the puppy dog to eat. It's sad, and it's probably a ploy by them. But again, homeless people can have dogs too, I suppose. I think they need to be able to take care of them, but I digress. What happens too is that we can have some strong negative emotions that lead us to thinking irrationally. And really what we need to do when we have negative emotion is use time to separate what's going on, the decision that we have to make, from the acute phase of the emotion. It sounds like, well, yeah, no doubt, we don't want to make a hasty decision. But guess what, everybody, including me, when you're in that situation where you're having a strong emotion and you just want to fire back, you don't think clearly. That's exactly what we're talking about right now. Everybody's able to reflect and think very clearly on something is when it's in the moment we have to be aware of it. So when we are in a moment where we're having a strong negative emotion, we have to remember just to separate what we're experiencing now from the decision that we're going to make, and count to 10. We have little kids and we watch Daniel Tiger, and Daniel Tiger's mom says, "When you feel so mad and you want to roar, take a deep breath and count to 4." Right, so she knows it. I mean, Mr. Rogers knew it. We get it. You also want to relax the mind and the body however you can. So just maybe it's meditation, maybe it's going for a walk, whatever it is. What do you have to do to get away from that situation before you make a decision about it? And then you can just shift your attention away. Okay. One of the things when we have strong negative emotions, which by the way aren't bad, I think I need to mention that. They're not bad to have those, but we need to be careful about making decisions in the midst of them because we know that we're susceptible to making bad decisions when we're angry or whatever. But the two main goals are distraction and relaxation. Those are the two big things. So if we can shift our attention away, we can distract ourselves from that emotion in a moment so that we can settle down and deal with it more effectively. Again, not to ignore it forever, but to separate ourselves from that emotion in that moment so we can make a good decision. You can always go back and reflect on the emotion and experience it again, but the reality is that you have to be able to make a good decision in that moment, and if you're feeling a really strong emotion, you're probably not going to make a great decision. The other thing you can do is reappraise a situation, which is very curious because these authors kind of said that Ellis's work is a little bit outdated, but cognitive reappraisal is exactly what the D in the ABCD method is, where you dispute the belief that you had or the behavior that you engaged in. Okay, so if that antecedent belief consequence or antecedent behavior consequence model leads us to something, it's that we can always dispute what we believed about a situation so that we don't behave a certain way. The example that I gave, by the way, remember, was if you get cut off by somebody and flip them off, then you've kind of had an antecedent getting cut off. The belief is that that person's a jerk, and then the behavior that goes along with it is that you flip them off back. The consequence is that you get more riled up or whatever. If you were to reappraise that situation, instead of automatically going to that person's a jerk and they deserve to see one of my fingers, it's a silly thing, then you can shift that to, oh, that person cut me off. Maybe they didn't see me. That happens sometimes. I've done it before too, right? You've done it before too. Maybe they're in a hurry. Maybe there's an emergency and they can't articulate it. They just have to go, whatever it is. Then you can all of a sudden say, okay, instead of having a belief that they're a jerk, maybe the belief is, oh, they're in trouble, or it was an accident and accidents happen. All of a sudden, you're not bent out of shape. You don't have to flip somebody off. They don't have to flip you off back, whatever it is. And then you can reappraise the situation, and that can shift the emotional response that you have to them. Then you can go on having a good day instead of thinking about all day how this jerk cut you off. All right. So you can, again, you look for cues in a situation that would allow for some other interpretation of what's going on. So no, they're not a jerk. Maybe they were late, or maybe they themselves got pushed over by a big truck or something like that. Who knows? Whatever it is, reappraisal is the ability for us to reframe what had happened or think differently about what had happened instead of just going with our knee-jerk response, which is usually not terribly great. Okay, so oddly, we're going to end with a stop and think. We don't often do this, but let's take a look at a stop and think and kind of see how we can apply a couple of these things. All right, so how do emotions affect the following debate? So here's a scenario. In a town hall meeting about how to deal with the malnourished, abandoned dogs running loose in a large city, A person advocates more extensive efforts to spay and neuter the dogs that are running loose. Okay. Another person urges citizens to spend more on food and care for abandoned dogs. To persuade the audience to adopt this food and care strategy, he shows a video clip of starving dogs that are barely able to stand up. Okay, so we clearly have some issues going on. We have some appeals to emotion that are going on here. So the advocate for the food for care strategy is using an appeal to emotion, in this case pity. You don't want to have poor hungry doggies, as the best evidence to persuade the audience that the position is best. All right, so what you can do is you can reframe this through reappraisal. You can separate the emotion from the from the claim, from the content of the claim, and you can figure out a better way to deal with this rather than just basing it on the pity that you have for the animals. So maybe you do need to feed the animals that are out there, but you probably do need to implement a spay and neuter procedure, or maybe figuring out a different way to regulate dog ownership or something like that. So whatever it is, you can reframe it and reappraise the situation in the terms of the content of what needs to happen for the safety and comfort of the animals long term, rather than just focusing on something that's based on eliminating your sense of guilt or pity for the animals in the first place. Well, it's okay to feel bad for the animal, but you have to think about the long-term consequences of making decisions too. We're not talking about killing the animal. We're talking about doing spay and neuter. That makes sense, right? All right, so that's all for Chapter 9. I know that it felt like a lot. There is a lot there. Read through some things. You're not going to have to remember everything about this, but do keep a lot of these things in mind, because our final project, which has to do with what we talked about last chapter and the War of the Worlds radio broadcast, will cover a lot of these things in some way. So you'll want to be aware of them. Maybe you jot down the key words so that you can remind yourself of them, or maybe you just look at some of the faulty thinking ideas that we talked about in the last set of slides. So keep track of those things. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and we will see you next time.